Hello, everyone, and welcome to War in Ukraine, How We Can Promote a Ceasefire and Peace Talks with Medea Benjamin. If you are new to New Hampshire Peace Action, I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the outgoing executive director. New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. Tonight, we are having a special program to host Medea Benjamin, who's moving through the Northeast on a book tour with her new book, Ukraine, Making Sense, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Before we get started, in the spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people, past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land and waterways where we live and work that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. So we want to mention that we know this is a topic that can bring up a lot of strong feelings. We hope that we can take care of ourselves and each other around this and remain respectful and civil. Know that we will use a mute and boot rule if you're rude to our speaker. There's a lot of disagreement about the history of the conflict in Ukraine. There's a lot of disagreement about how we should be engaging as a nation. And we're looking forward to hearing Medea Benjamin's opinions on that and thoughts on that. And this is my first time hosting Medea Benjamin in my 14 years here as director of New Hampshire Peace Action. We've never quite managed to get you into the state, but Medea is a founder of Global Exchange and Code Pink. And has been running Code Pink for many, many years. She's been arrested. I don't know how many times, but I know that it is counted in dozens, if not hundreds of times, fighting for justice and trying to stop the war machine. And I'm very excited to finally have my chance to host Medea and to have you on tonight. So Medea, why don't you take it away and talk to us a little bit about your book and about what the reception has been and what's been happening as you've moved around the country talking about this.
Yes, thanks, Will, and thanks so much for having me tonight and giving me a chance to talk to folks. I was going to say how important it is to talk to people in New Hampshire because of the outsized role that you play in U.S. politics in these upcoming special presidential elections, especially. But I see we also have people tonight from all over the world, including from Sri Lanka and Canada and all over the U.S. So it's great to be with everyone. I'm going to put a link to the book in the chat in case anybody is interested in getting a copy of it. And I have been on a book tour. I see we have Jackie Deveneaux in this call. She just was kind enough to set up a lovely tour of Maine. And I was in one place in New Hampshire that was in Albany, New Hampshire, where I did meet a number of people from the area and saw, wow, you people in New Hampshire get to meet presidential candidates all the time. There was one guy there who says he has them come into his backyard, and he's had everybody from Robert Kennedy, and he's hosting Christie and, across the spectrum. So it is interesting. We're not going to get into that tonight about why New Hampshire plays that role and if it's fair or not, but the fact is that you all do. And I also want to say that, as you pointed out, Will, how difficult this issue is, especially among people who consider themselves part of a peace movement. I have friends who grew up as Quakers, continue to be Quakers, and yet feel that this war is different and they have to support arming Ukraine. There are many divisions within our movements, within our families, and probably within our own heads at times. And yes, I want to acknowledge that and respect that. There have been many times on my book tour where I've been followed around by people who are handing out flyers against me, sometimes protesting, sometimes trying to get me canceled. And that's been successful in a couple of places, including universities, bookstores, and peace churches, which surprises me because we really need so much more discussion about this issue than we've been having. But some of the criticisms have been that I'm an apologist for Putin. And I just want to start off saying that that's just ridiculous, because I know that if I were living in Russia, I would be in prison right now for protesting this war. I have tremendous respect for my Russian friends and colleagues who have been arrested for protesting, who have fled the country because they refuse to fight in this war, or who stay inside the country and risk arrest for the kind of networking they're doing to build an anti-war movement inside of Russia. I also want to say that I recently came from Ukraine. I do have ethnic roots on my father's side as Ukrainian Jews, but I never spent much time there. I was recently there to just get a feeling from people about this war. And it was heartbreaking to see the daily funerals that were taking place for young men who were killed in battle, to go out to the cemeteries and see the weeping wives and mothers, the children laying flowers on the graves of the fathers they would never see. I had many discussions with people about this war, and certainly you can understand the calls that people have to keep the fighting going, the revenge that they want to take against the Russians who have killed their family members and destroyed a lot of their homes. But I also felt that people are really getting tired of the war and the fighting, and that there were a number of people who said, we just want this war to end. We don't see any end in sight. When we started to talk about specifics, they would oftentimes just say, shh, be quiet. We're really not allowed to speak openly because it is considered treasonous to be calling for peace talks. And just like in Russia right now, it is very difficult to be openly calling for peace talks. But nevertheless, we live here in the United States. And so it's important to talk about the US role, whether it's in history or whether it's today. And that's why we wrote this book as a basic primer. And that's why I've been going around the country, because I think it's really important to build up an anti-war movement. And to build that up, people have to have a basic understanding of what role the US could play in trying to bring an end to this tragic war. One of the issues that's very contentious is exactly what is the role of NATO. And I think that those who support NATO are constantly calling it a defensive alliance. And I think that is totally wrong. If you look at the history of NATO, which was to counter the Soviet Union, it did that. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union had fallen apart and NATO's counterpart, the Warsaw Pact, had dissolved, there were calls for NATO to dissolve as well. But it didn't do that. And instead, the NATO leaders, particularly from the United States, made a deal with the Soviets that they would not expand NATO. Meanwhile, NATO has not only expanded, but just to follow up on this issue of whether it's a defensive alliance, NATO has gotten involved in illegal bombings in Kosovo and then far beyond the North Atlantic, such as the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Libya. And in NATO's most recent meeting that took place in Vilnius, Lithuania, just a month ago, it was not only the NATO members, but special invited guests, NATO partners that were coming from the Asian Pacific, specifically from South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, why was NATO so intent on having those countries? Because NATO, just like the US official policy and the US military policy, is that China is the real adversary. And NATO is gearing up to have its partners in place for a potential war with China. And so we have to think in all of this, how insane it is that we're in the midst of this war, and yet US and NATO are already planning for the next war against another nuclear country, an enormous country. So going back to the issue of NATO expansion, that is something that some people today say, well, it's not really an important issue. It's one that Putin uses as a justification, but he was never all that concerned about it. Well, if you look back at the history, starting in 1991, as we do in the book, there are so many different warnings, not only from Russians themselves, but from US ambassadors, US foreign policy experts, US academics. And there are a list of them that all say basically the same thing, that this issue of the expansion of NATO is something that is not only a red line to Putin, but to the entire Russian establishment, that see it as an existential threat were Ukraine to be a member of a hostile military alliance. We even have the writings, the cables that were sent by the present head of the CIA, William Burns, that warned about this and even predicted back in the 90s that this could end up in a civil war because of the differences that existed in NATO between the pro-Western western part of the country and the pro-Russian eastern part of the country. And he said that if there were indeed a civil war, then Russia would be forced to decide if it would get involved, something that it does not want to do. So there were all of these warnings that were ignored. They were ignored by Democratic administrations like Bill Clinton. They were ignored by Republican administrations like George Bush, who said in 2008 at the NATO summit, pushed the other NATO members, including a number of them that were very reluctant, knowing how provocative this was, push them to indeed publicly say that NATO would invite Ukraine to be a member. Well, this issue of NATO is not the only indication of provocations coming from the West. There's also direct involvement by the United States in the internal affairs of Ukraine. We will probably see in years to come, as we have seen in other instances of US interference, when we get Freedom of Information Act requests, just how involved the US was in the internal affairs of Ukraine. But we know from some documents and from some footage and from some leaked audio tapes that the US has been very much involved. For example, in 2013, we had Victoria Nuland, who was the Undersecretary of State, saying that the US had already spent $3 billion, a lot of money back then, creating civil society groups in Ukraine. And you can imagine the civil society groups. They were pro-Western groups, anti-Russian groups. And then you had the uprising a year later in 2014, known as the Maidan uprising, in which you had the population of Ukraine that wanted to rise up, some of them, against a democratically elected government that was a corrupt government. And unfortunately, Ukraine has been known to be the most corrupt country in Europe. It continues to have that a black mark against it. And so people rose up against Viktor Yanukovych in what was known as the Maidan uprising in 2014. That was a popular uprising that turned from a nonviolent one into a violent one, partially because of the government's response and partially because it got taken over by paramilitary groups as part of a right-wing neo-Nazi grouping. And the violence then led to what I consider a coup, because it did overthrow a democratically elected government. And the US was directly involved in deciding who would run Ukraine. We have the evidence of Victoria Nuland herself out in Maidan Square encouraging the protesters to overthrow their government. We have the leaked audio tape between her and the US ambassador to Ukraine at the time, in which they discussed who would be shoved aside and who would be put in to rule the new government in Ukraine. So that is incredible examples that we have of direct US interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine. When the government of Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown and a new government put in place, there were people in the eastern part of the country who did not recognize the new government, considered it illegitimate, and rose up and created the breakaway republics of the Donbass with the help of Russia. Russia also came in and retook Crimea, a part of the country that had belonged to Russia for over 200 years. It's where Russia has its warm water port that gives it access to the Black Sea and to the Mediterranean. It's also one of the very few bases, foreign military bases, that Russia has. Russia came in and took back an area where Crimea does also have majority Russian speakers, ethnic Russians. And at one time, back in 1991, when Ukraine had declared its independence, there was a referendum in Crimea, this is way before Putin, that asked them, did they want to become a part of Ukraine? And there were 94% of Crimeans who said no, they did not want to become a part of Ukraine. So there are many indications that Crimea is extremely important to the Russians. And that's why they went in and took Crimea back. So this all happened in 2014, and there were efforts the year later to try to stop the civil war that broke out in the Donbass, and an agreement was signed called the Minsk Accords. Unfortunately, the Minsk Accords were never implemented. And part of that is because of these right-wing groups in Ukraine that wouldn't even let leaders of Ukraine like Zelensky, who campaigned as a peace president and wanted to end the civil war, wanted to meet with the leaders of the breakaway republics. And these neo-Nazi groups said, no way, if you do that, you will be hanging from a tree, threatened to kill him. The Minsk Accords were supposed to be also overseen by European countries, particularly France, Germany, and Poland. And I wondered when we were writing the book, why didn't they do more to make sure that the political part of the Minsk agreements was implemented? And that was to change the constitution in Ukraine and give the Donbass area autonomy. Now, when they say autonomy, that doesn't mean they're independent. It doesn't mean they would have been part of Russia. It means they would have autonomous status within the nation state of Ukraine. But that was never implemented. And there were recent interviews done with the heads of state of France and Germany, separate interviews, heads of state at that time, who both said a similar thing, that they really didn't see the Minsk Accords as a peace agreement, but more as an opportunity to buy time to arm Ukraine and train Ukraine military so that it could take back the Donbass. And indeed, after these agreements were signed, instead of trying to keep the peace, the US started sending in weapons. And under Obama, there was a stipulation that they be defensive weapons. Under Trump, he lifted that, and offensive weapons started flowing into Ukraine. And the NATO countries were training about 10,000 Ukrainian military every single year. So there was a buildup and there was a civil war in which about 14,000 people were being killed, mostly inside the Donbass. There was a lot of pressure on Russia, inside Russia, to do something about it. Unfortunately, Russia, instead of doing something nonviolently, invaded. We call this invasion completely unjustified, illegal according to the UN Charter, and immoral and very brutal. And after the invasion, as we know, the West got more involved in arming Ukraine. And today we have the US having given over $114 billion for both economic, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine. And Biden asking now for another $24 billion that will be voted on in September. We have Biden, who has been very conflictive in terms of what weapons to send, because he has not wanted to get the US directly involved in a war in Russia, meaning US troops involved. And so he has not wanted to send long-range, high-powered weapons that would be used inside Russia by the Ukrainians. And that means that he has had his own red lines, but he has continued to step over them, whether it was the HIMARS, whether it was the Patriot missiles, the tanks that he wasn't going to send, the F-16s, like it looks like they're going to be sent. Cluster bombs, a weapon that had been banned by the international community with 123 countries, saying these weapons were so abhorrent because they break up into small bombs that then kill civilians for years to come when farmers step on them in the fields or children pick up these shiny little bomblets and it blows off their arms or legs or kills them. But unfortunately, both Russia and Ukraine were using cluster bombs, but the amount of cluster bombs that Biden has sent has increased tremendously, the number of those very abhorrent weapons that are being used now in Ukraine. So we have all kinds of weapons pouring in, and yet we have to look at what has been the result. And while there was a counteroffensive, the first one by Ukraine in the spring that was quite successful, they haven't been able to replicate that. There was supposed to be an offensive that happened in the spring, and that was postponed until the summer. The summer offensive has been going on for 2 months now without much success at all. In fact, there are Congress people now who have been great supporters of Ukraine who are recognizing this counteroffensive as a failure. But we knew even before that it would not be able to succeed because we had seen Pentagon documents that were leaked months ago that said no matter how valiantly the Ukrainians had been fighting on the ground, they didn't have the ability to defeat Russia, that this had become early on a war of attrition, a stalemate in which many, many soldiers on both sides are dying, but it's not going to change the correlation of forces on the ground. And that's why we had the U.S. Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, who is the number one military advisor to Biden, who said after the first successful counteroffensive back in the early winter, that Ukraine was in a very good position to seize the moment and go to peace talks. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so here we are in the midst of a war that certainly looks like it is unwinnable on the battlefield, but could very easily expand into a European war, a NATO war, if one of the NATO countries was attacked perhaps accidentally, like almost happened when there was a stray missile that went into Poland, or it could lead to a nuclear confrontation. And with this issue of Crimea that is so important to Putin, there have been generals, like a general from Germany, who has said that if the West tries to help Ukraine take back Crimea, it would increase tremendously the possibility that Russia would use a nuclear weapon. So we have the potential for a much wider war and a war of a stalemate on the ground. And so where does this lead us? Well, you would think it would lead us to peace talks, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Those who say you can't talk to Putin, it's important to look back at the beginning of this conflict, when just less than a month after the Russian invasion, there were efforts by international actors to jump in there and try to find a solution to the conflict, knowing that in the initial period, that is the best time to try to find a compromise before both sides are hardened. And that's why the head of Turkey, Erdogan, started hosting peace talks that were quite successful. In fact, they were so successful that there was a 15-point peace plan that they arrived at in the early part of April. And the basis for that was that the Ukrainians would not become members of NATO. They would be a neutral country. Russian troops would leave. There would be internationally supervised referendum in the Donbass so that the people there could determine how they wanted to be ruled. And the issue of Crimea would be pushed aside for several years to come. This agreement that was so close was then sabotaged by Boris Johnson from the UK, who flew to Kyiv and met with Zelensky and said, the collective West does not want you to compromise. We will not back such a compromise, but we will be with you if you continue fighting. It was also the time that we heard Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin saying that we must use this moment to weaken Russia. And indeed, the goalposts were changed. And many would say this has become a proxy war between the US/NATO and Russia. And this is a war to weaken Russia. There are those, though, who continue to say that it's impossible to talk to the Russians. And I want to give some other examples. One is the talks that have been happening when both sides accused each other of shelling very close to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. And there was a tremendous fear that this would result in an explosion that would spread radiation throughout Europe. And so there were efforts to mediate talks between Russia and Ukraine that were successful in getting representatives from the International Atomic Energy Agency into that Zaporizhia plant and try to calm the conflict there. There have also been successful talks until recently around the grain deal, because, who knew before this war started that both Ukraine and Russia are so important to the global grain trade, and that it was important to guarantee that wheat and other grains from Ukraine would be able to get out of the country and also create a land as well as a sea corridor for that. And Russia wanted to be able to get its grain and its fertilizer out of the country. So lifting of the sanctions that made it difficult for Russia to do that. And so this grain deal was signed. It has been in effect for most of the time of the war and successful in getting tens of millions of tons of grain out of the region. Recently, Russia pulled back on it, saying that the part of the agreement that would help Russia to get its grain and fertilizers out was not being adhered to. But there are still talks to try to get Russia back into that deal. There have also been lots of discussions and successful negotiations on prisoner exchanges, with thousands of prisoners being exchanged, with the remains of prisoners being sent back to their respective countries, with wounded prisoners being exchanged. So those are examples of ongoing talks. But how do we get back to talks around the big issues of ending this war? Well, there have been efforts by a number of international players. We have seen the Pope take this issue very seriously and name an experienced envoy from the Vatican who has met with all sides in this. We, as our coalition in the United States called Peace in Ukraine, we've been taking out ads in religious newspapers to support the Pope's efforts because we think that it's such an important attempt. We've also seen leaders in Latin America come forward and offer to negotiate, the head of India doing that as well. We have seen efforts by 6 nations in Africa who say this conflict is not just affecting Europe, this is affecting the entire world. And Africa, it's led to increased hunger because of the increased prices of energy as well as goods. And there has been the effort by the Chinese who put forward a 12-point peace plan that was initially looked on favorably by both Ukraine and Russia. Why? Not because the peace plan was so great, but because Ukraine has important trading agreements with China, and Russia is now dependent on China for the sale of its energy. And so China has a lot of legitimacy in terms of pushing both sides to the table. But unfortunately, the US just pushed aside those efforts and said that China was in no position to act as a mediator. That's why when Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, who's supposed to be the #1 diplomat and has been doing virtually nothing to try to find a diplomatic solution, when he was speaking before Congress, a number of us in Code Pink got up in that hearing and asked him to do his job, to be a diplomat, to find a solution. We said, if you don't like the Chinese peace plan, where is your peace plan? At which moment the burly police from the Capitol came and arrested us. But I think it's a very important question to keep asking. Recently, there was a gathering in Saudi Arabia for, quote, peace talks. It's kind of ironic in Saudi Arabia being hosted by one of the most repressive people in the entire world, Mohammed bin Salman, whose claim to fame is having authorized the killing and chopping up of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But nevertheless, any attempts to find peace should be welcomed. And many countries were invited to be part of those talks. It was reported in the US press that Russia didn't attend, but it was not reported in most of the US press that Russia was not invited to attend. And that Zelensky's idea of a peace plan is really not a peace plan, but a negotiating position. His position is Russian troops must leave. Russia relieve every area of the Donbass, all of Crimea, that Russia must be punished for war crimes. Russia must pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And many people might feel that that is a good position, but that is not a compromise. That is a negotiating position. So I don't think we could look at the talks in Saudi Arabia as serious attempts at peace talks. Unfortunately, our government has a major role in having sabotaged former peace talks that were happening and continuing to fuel a war instead of supporting efforts at serious peace talks. Where does that leave us? That leaves us in a position, I think, as peacemakers of trying to push our government. Because while the Biden administration says nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, meaning that the Ukrainians have to decide when to come to the peace table and whether they want to compromise territory or not, there are two facts. One, they were ready to do that back in April. And two, they are dependent on the United States, not only for weapons, but for paying all of the bills of the government. Biden at one point at a press conference, I think, put in his foot in his mouth when he was talking about how much the U.S. was contributing to the economy of Ukraine. He said, we're even paying the pension of the Ukrainian workers, at which point many workers in the United States wondered why they're not getting a pension. But the fact is that the U.S. is keeping the lights on for the Ukrainian government. And indeed, if the U.S. said now is the time for peace talks, there would be a great amount of pressure on Zelensky to do just that. But we have the White House that is not doing that, and we have a Congress that is not doing that either. But interestingly enough, the U.S. public is changing its opinion about this war. While early on there was a lot of support for it, the most recent polls, like the CNN one that was just done in July, showed now that the majority of Americans, 55%, not only do they want peace talks, but they don't want the U.S. to continue funding this war. And you might think that that would be the equivalent of 55% of the members of Congress, but it's far from that. In fact, the Democrats in Congress are the quietest because it is a Democrat in the White House. And when 30 of those Democrats from the Progressive Caucus signed a very mild letter saying, in addition to economic support and military support, it would be good to push for negotiations, they were so pilloried by their own party that within 24 hours, they withdrew that letter. And they have not spoken out since then and have been authorizing every single tranche of weapons and to Ukraine that the White House has asked for. The majority of Republicans are hawks as well. In fact, as we go to these hearings, we often see them saying that the stalemate on the ground is the fault of Biden because he is not giving enough weapons and not giving them fast enough. So the only ones who are speaking out so far are the extreme right of the Republican Party, which is quite ironic because I really do believe that if there were a Republican in the White House, we would be in the company of people like Barbara Lee, who is against going against war after the 9/11 attacks. We would be in the company of the Squad. We would be in the company of Bernie Sanders. But because it's a Democrat in the White House, they are being told this is a national security issue. You have to toe the line. We have to show the Democrats as united on this. Elections are coming up. Let's not break ranks. And so this extreme right of the Republican Party are the ones that are calling for very rational things. And these are people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, who you might know is very irrational when it comes to many other things. And they are calling for an audit to see where all this money is going. They are calling for an inspector general to oversee the billions of dollars. They are calling for an amendment that simply said, we want a report. And in that report that we are asking for within 90 days, we want to know, what is your definition of victory? Is it going back to the territory when Russia invaded a year and a half ago, or is it going back to 2014, meaning getting back all of Donbass and the Crimea? Or is it overthrowing the Russian government? We'd like to know your definition of victory. What is your diplomatic path, and how much is this going to cost the American taxpayer? Well, this was an amendment to the Pentagon budget, and when the amendment was voted on, there were quite a number of Republicans that voted for it. In fact, it was 129 Republicans, and yet there were zero Democrats that would ask for only a report. I find this appalling. I find this unacceptable. And that's why I think it's up to us to really be pushing all of the members of Congress to say that with an unwinnable war that could lead to a third world war, where is your peace plan? I mentioned the changing of public opinion in the United States. And there's another factor that's given us, and I include myself in this, having a very, very small soapbox and oftentimes being canceled, that there are people who have a big soapbox and reach millions of people, and those are presidential candidates. And right now we have presidential candidates from different political parties, from Donald Trump to Ron DeSantis to Robert F. Kennedy to Cornel West, who are calling for a ceasefire and peace talks. And I think between the public opinion and these presidential candidates and the stalemate on the ground, this is putting pressure on the Biden administration that is starting to see this as a liability in the next presidential elections. So that's why I think the work of peacemakers around the country is so important. That's why I encourage you to join with the coalition called Peace in Ukraine, that you can find online, peaceinukraine.org, that is planning global days of action, September 30th to October 8th. And we'd really like to see actions all over the country. We're planning a national lobby day that will happen on October 4th, that we want people to join us in contacting their members of Congress all together on that date. And we are also, through Peace in Ukraine, expanding our work to reach out to environmentalists, to reach out to the faith-based community, to reach out to people who have been working on arms reduction and a ban on nuclear weapons, to expand the voices in the United States of people who are advocating for peace. And finally, I just want to say that we are part of a global majority that is really pushing for an end to this conflict. And that's reflected by all of these different heads of states from Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere who are pushing for peace. And it's reflected by the many representatives of countries that are saying that they want to find a solution and not be pushed by the United States to take sides. And the person whose voice I think reflects this the best is the president of Brazil, known by the short name of Lula. He was invited to the White House by President Biden, and he was pushed by Biden to send weapons to Ukraine. And he came out saying, no, that's not what is needed. What's needed is interlocutors who will talk to the Russians about what a horrific mistake they made with this invasion and talk to the Ukrainians about how important it is to get serious about peace talks. He said, we do not want to join this war. We want to end this war. And I think that's the reflection of the majority of the people in this country right now who don't want to see us continue to fuel such a dangerous, unwinnable war that is causing so much suffering in Ukraine and around the world, but want us to find ways to end this war. So thank you so much. And I think we can open it up to discussion.
Great. So if folks want to type their questions in the chat, I'm happy to read them off. You can also in the chat ask to be recognized. The hand raise function in Zoom will work, but I'm more likely to see it. You could also just put an asterisk in the chat. We've got a bunch of questions already, Medea, so I'm just going to dive right in if that's all right with you.
Please.
First question's from Eleanor, who says, how has your thinking about the war in Ukraine changed and evolved since the publication of your book?
Well, I'm working on a updated edition right now, and I'm really quite surprised at how on the mark the book is. What we are doing in the updated edition is really adding in new events that have occurred, confirmations of issues that we wrote. The updated issue in terms of where different countries around the world are standing on this issue. But I would say my thinking about this war has not changed since writing the book. From the very beginning, the title of the book, Making Sense of a Senseless War, really gives the idea that this is a war that could have and should have been prevented. And I think that's what we laid out very clearly in the book.
Thanks. Next question is from Moji Aga, who's the founder of the Iranian Nonviolence program and has been on our program a few times before. Moji, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, and thank you, and hello, Medea. I don't know whether you remember me, but
Of course I do. Nice to hear your voice.
Thank you. My camera doesn't work for some reason. I was in 2007. I was the delegation leader of two of the citizen diplomacy delegations to Iran, organized by Global Exchange. And so thank you for founding that organization. And I am an Iranian American, as you know, and a nonviolence activist. And my question is, right now, those, it's funny that, that the likes of Boebert and Marjorie Green, whatever, they need to be asked, if you are so peace-loving regarding Ukraine, how come when it comes to Israel, you are ally of Netanyahu and even, hawks to his right? So
absolutely, yeah.
But let me ask you my question.
Sure.
So that you could, thank you. Being from Iran and noticing that the supreme leader of Iran is essentially a puppet, has turned Iran into a puppet of Putin for the needs of, as Dr. Mossadegh, the 70th anniversary of the 1953 coup was just yesterday. Dr. Mossadegh said internal despotism and external colonialism are two sides of the same coin, especially when they need one another as enemy. So what I see in the case of Ukraine, on the one hand, which obviously NATO, pushed and provoked, but Putin, being the internal despot of Russia, actually has benefited from the external colonialism of NATO. and they need one another as enemy. Therefore, my question to you is, if one accepts this premise that internal despotism and external colonialism need one another as enemy, in any continuing conflict, one should not just look at the military industrial complex in this country as the side that keeps the conflict going. It's a mutual dance of two sides of the conflict that need the conflict for their own purposes and for the benefit of their military industrial complexes. Please comment. Thank you.
Oh, that's very deep, and I'm not sure that in the case of this conflict, I would agree, because I think that this is not benefiting Putin. Putin's popularity rating was higher before this war. He is having to contend with a war that he perhaps thought would be quick and successful in putting a new government into Ukraine, but certainly that didn't happen. And while Russia has amazingly weathered the economic storm so far, with the ruble not collapsing as the West thought it would, the sanctions are having an impact and will have more of an impact as time goes by. And it's made Russia weaker rather than stronger. So I don't think in the case of Russia, this war has benefited Putin or the Russian elite. I think it is, in the end, weakened them and divided them. In the terms of the United States, we have a much stronger military-industrial complex that is so interwoven into our entire economy. And I think you're right there in terms of the US needing an enemy. That's why I think it's important for us to recognize it's not just this Ukraine war in an effort to weaken Russia, but it's important to look at all of the provocative things that the US is doing against China right now. And we must find ways to confront our own military-industrial congressional complex, and let's make sure we recognize how much the congressional part is part of it, because even the Congress people that many of us might like on other domestic issues tend to take money from the weapons industry and be influenced by them.
Iran's supreme leader has said on many occasions that he is happy that the US attacked Ukraine and Russia. So please keep in mind the people, internal despots that benefit from external colonialism and the military-industrial complex. Thank you.
Thanks, Moji, and thank you, Medea. There's a lot to think about there. Michael Hoey has a question in the chat, and it's: do you have an update on Ukrainian children? I know there were news reports about Ukrainian children being taken to Russia. Do you have any updates? Have you come upon that in any of your research? Do you know if that's still happening? Go ahead. Oh, I think Medea has frozen, or maybe it's me. I see other people moving. Let's give it a minute. Sometimes the okay, I think we have you back, Medea. Were you able to hear the question? Seems we had a freeze on your internet.
Yeah, sorry. Just in case, I will call in on my phone if that happens again. You know, this issue of the children is one that's very hard to Hello?
Hey, Medea, maybe try turning off your camera. That usually solves it. We're getting garbled sound from you right now.
Phone.
So give it a moment. Do you think?
Will, do you want to turn off her camera?
She just did. So.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Still on my end.
Are you there, Medea? Sorry about this, folks. One of the hazards of doing online programs. Sometimes, sometimes the internet doesn't agree.
Yeah, sorry. In terms of the children, I think it's an issue that is hard to discern the extent to what happened. I have read reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. I've read the Russian side of things that says that they're taking children to Russia to get them away from dangerous areas and that they have been sending them back. I think, this is one of the areas that you can call that in the fog of war, it's very hard to figure out. But I do think we should recognize that war crimes are being committed, that war itself is a crime, but certainly there are war crimes being committed on a regular basis, and that while some of the accusations might be exaggerated, there is probably a lot of truth to them as well.
Thank you. And we're running low on time. I'm going to try to get through the last few questions in the chat. Evelyn Ophir asks, could you talk about the willingness of Ukraine and Russia to negotiate in the spring of 2022, and why that didn't materialize?
Well, as I said during the talk, they did come up with this incredible plan. And in fact, when the leaders of South Africa and other African nations went to meet with Putin recently, he waved around this 15-point peace plan and said, look how close we were to solving this problem, and the West didn't want it to happen. And there were other confirmations of this. There was an effort by the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Naftali Bennett, who was also trying to negotiate a ceasefire. And he said they were very, very close to an agreement when the West blocked it. So these are several examples that show how, yes, they were close to agreements.
All right, so I do think we're gonna run out.
Well, we have until 8:30 tonight.
Okay. Oh, all right. If we can go over, then let's just keep going with what we've got in the chat. So Evelyn Tischer asks, there's a pacifist movement in Ukraine headed by Yuri Shelizensky. Hope I got that right. Any idea how large that movement is, or if it's growing during this time?
That's another one that's really hard to tell. Yuri, I think, is an incredibly brave person. His home was recently raided by the agents from the Ukrainian government. He had his electronics confiscated. He is facing potential charges, and he certainly does have a network, but people are afraid. And some of them have already gone to prison because they refuse to fight. They're conscientious objectors. So we have no idea about how large the movement is, but we do know that people are afraid to be public about their opposition to the war. We also know that there are a lot of men of military age who have escaped Ukraine. Legally, between 18 and 60, they're not allowed to leave the country. And in fact, Zelensky just fired a number of the military recruiters because they were taking bribes for people to get out of serving in the military.
Wow. So next question's from Will Thomas, who's our state coordinator for Veterans for Peace. Will says, aren't the Republicans saying that U.S. military and economic assistance should be cut drastically to Ukraine? How credible is this? Are the Republicans making it a campaign issue? And I know during the midterm elections, Kevin McCarthy had said that if the House Republicans won significantly, that Ukraine funding could be on the chopping block. How serious do you think the Republicans are?
I think Kevin McCarthy has already walked that back, and he wants to be in line with his other Republican high-ranking people like Mike McCall, who's the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who is very pro sending weapons and more money to Ukraine. I don't think Kevin McCarthy is going to try to block this, but other members of the Republican Party, particularly in the Freedom Caucus, are going to. They're going to vote against it. They're going to keep reminding Kevin McCarthy of what he said. And one very, very interesting new development that I think is a game changer is a Republican, Andy Harris, who was the co-chair or is the co-chair of the Ukraine caucus, one of the most staunch allies of Ukraine in the Congress. And he came out the other day looking at the situation on the ground in terms of the counteroffensive. And he said that I'm not sure it's winnable anymore. And the US should push Zelensky to sign a peace proposal. And so that is really quite remarkable. I don't think that the Republicans are going to be the ones who oppose the continued funding are going to be strong enough to block this, because they're going to have all the Democrats and a number of Republicans. But I think they're going to get stronger as time goes by.
All right. It's I don't think that helps the case for diplomacy, but or the prospects. The case is strong, but the prospects for diplomacy. Next question's from Don Smith. Would you say that the U.S. intentionally provoked the conflict? Diplomats and even RAND Corporation said that NATO expansion into Ukraine would result in a military response by Russia. The war in Ukraine makes complete sense if you regard it as part of the neocons' plan to overextend and weaken Russia.
I think the US laid a trap for Russia, just like they did in Afghanistan, to sink Russia into that struggle and weaken it. And the result of that was the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think we see a similar thing happening now, where the US, or some people within the US and the neocons who have such a stronghold on our foreign policy, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican administration, I do think they wanted this conflict to happen. I do think they want to use it to bleed Russia, but they never seem to get it right. And they now have pushed Russia into the hands of China, strengthened that relationship, and they have divided the globe in such a way that there's now a stronger push to create more of a multipolar world. We see the meeting of the BRICS countries that are happening this weekend in South Africa, where it's not only Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but about 24 countries that want to join that grouping, and a greater effort now to de-dollarize the world economy. So I don't know that the neocons' idea of provoking this war as a way to strengthen US hegemony is actually going to work out for them.
All right, so I'm going to move to Emily's question, which is a bit of an expansion. Then I'll move to David and then Matthew. So Emily says, could you expand on Don's question above on how the U.S. military-industrial complex has profited from the war, and the Seymour Hersh reporting on the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline? Additionally, what do you think of China's efforts of diplomacy?
So the military-industrial complex is getting among its highest profits ever from this war. And not only is it the money that we allocate for this, we say to Ukraine, most of the weapons money doesn't even go to Ukraine. It goes to US weapons companies and mostly the big five. But it's not just that, it's the expansion of the money that the Europeans are now putting into their militaries and the pressure on them to buy weapons from the United States. So definitely they are major winners in this war. But I think it's also important to recognize they're not the only ones. The energy companies, and this relates to the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. Before Seymour Hersh's article came out, I remember going to hearings years ago when Ted Cruz, who represents energy companies from all over Texas, would say, why are we allowing the Europeans to build this Nord Stream pipeline? And he would, almost like pounding on the table, we've got to stop this from happening. And most Americans had no idea what the Nord Stream pipeline was. And lo and behold, it has now been blown up. And Seymour Hersh's account is something that we have to take a lot more seriously than members of the US government have taken, because it's a very, very well documented piece that he put out. And while in the past he would have published it in a place like the New York Times and the New Yorker, they won't take that kind of writing anymore. He had to do it in his Substack. But nevertheless, these energy companies have benefited tremendously by taking over the place of Russia in supplying both oil and gas to Europe at much higher prices than the Europeans were paying from the Russians. And this has also been a justification by the Biden administration to expand licenses for drilling, licenses for refineries. The dirty energy companies have had profits like they have never seen before in their histories. And finally, let's also recognize that other US companies are either starting to invest or waiting until what they hope will be an end to the war and invest in the rebuilding. And we see memorandum of understanding being signed by the Zelensky administration with financial companies like BlackRock, like JP Morgan, and putting up websites to invest in Ukraine, with Zelensky saying this is the best investment opportunity since World War II. So there are many companies, unfortunately, that are benefiting from this tragedy.
Thank you, Medea. David, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Medea, for another very powerful presentation. You always speak truth to power. I imagine you saw that there were 10 members of the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. This was about 10 days ago, that made a very courageous and powerful statement in response to some of the Russian government officials threatening the possible use of nuclear weapons, and who said this not only threatens the lives of billions of people in other parts of the world, but we will also be in ashes. I mean, it's unbelievable how courageous that was. Do you know of any high-level government officials in our country or other NATO countries that are making that kind of courageous statements to our governments?
Well, thank you for bringing that up, David. And yes, that was a powerful and very important statement that was made because of the cavalier way that some other members of the Russian elite have talked about the use of nuclear weapons. I don't know of any similar statement. I mean, we know that Biden once, not at a policy discussion, but at a fundraiser, talked about the possibility of nuclear Armageddon and said that Putin needed an off-ramp. But he certainly has not talked about that publicly, nor given Putin that off-ramp that is so desperately needed. And the threat of a nuclear confrontation grows every day that this conflict continues. There was one point when the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who's a real hawk, said that this could this conflict could spin terribly out of control. And I think he was referring to a nuclear confrontation, but yet he didn't follow that up by any kind of statement about how important it was to end this conflict and to get a commitment from all parties that nuclear weapons would not be used. I think, as you know, David, talks are needed not only between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and the United States, the ones who control 95% of the world's nuclear weapons. And that's why we have to be pushing that our government engage in direct talks with the Russians and get back into these agreements that the US has pulled out of in past administrations, including the Trump administration, so that there are no agreements now that are really keeping the communication going between the United States and Russia. You mentioned this powerful statement that came out from Russia, but I also want to mention that there are some talks that are going on at the unofficial level, known as Track 2 talks, between some members of the US foreign policy establishment and the Russians, precisely because they are so worried about the possibility of a nuclear conflict. And I was very pleased when I heard about those discussions, especially since it said that the outcome of these discussions is being reported to the White House, and that in one of those discussions, the foreign minister of Russia participated. And so that is an indication that there are other people in other venues that have some power in this country that are trying to insert their voices to stop this from becoming a nuclear war.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Medea. Thank you, David, for the question. Embellish Matthew's question a little bit. So his question is, a while ago, F-16s might have been considered a red line for Russia. Are they now acceptable? And what's the next red line? And I want to mention cluster munitions, which of course are illegal under international law, illegal under, the transfer is illegal under US law. That a number of red lines have been moved over the last couple of years as we've what we thought Russia's red lines are moved, and what we thought our leadership's limits on what they were willing to transfer have been shifting. What's the next line, and when does it get out of control?
Well, I would say it's already out of control, but it's an important question because it's a question about where this is going. And I think that the F-16s now, they're already training Ukrainian pilots, but they won't be trained and ready, it seems, for almost another year. And that's why Republican war hawks are pushing Biden and say he took so long to agree to this, that he delayed everything. There's the weapon system called the ATACMS that long range could be used to attack Russia, that Biden does not want to give, and yet there are Republicans, as well as Zelensky, of course, who are pushing him to authorize those weapons. And then where does it lead? I think it leads to a request for troops. And let's understand that the US has about 100,000 troops in Europe already, and that Biden just called up 3,000 reservists to be sent to the area. And while he has said repeatedly that he will not be sending US troops precisely because he knows how unpopular that is in the United States, somebody just wrote Polish troops might be involved. And I think that is the danger. I was just going to go there because the head of Poland has talked about the possibility of sending Polish troops, and I think would like to. I think he's being held back by NATO right now. But imagine if Polish troops go in, Polish troops are going to be killed. And then that is NATO troops being killed, and will call in Article 5 of NATO, saying that attack on one is an attack on all. And the other countries, including the United States, will be pushed into that. So I think these red lines that have been crossed over and over again, there are still some really dangerous ones that haven't been crossed that we have to make sure don't get crossed, and that we keep saying to Biden and the members of Congress, not only do we want to stop all of the weapons that are being sent, but we want to make it clear that the American people do not want troops sent, and that that's not up to Biden anyway, that it's Congress that has to declare war. And certainly if US troops were involved, that would have to go through the Congress. And I think there would be a big fight if it did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Question from Carol Weingeist. The Republic of Georgia wants to join the EU. Do they ever have a chance with what's going on in Ukraine?
I don't know. I think they do have a chance, just like there's a possibility of Ukraine joining the EU, and that might be one of the sweeteners in the deal for a compromise, is that the European countries give preference to Ukraine to be able to join the EU. So yes, I think it's a real possibility.
All right, we have some repeat questions from a few folks. I want to make sure that everybody gets a question once, but Shar Leahy, can you address the danger of Ukraine escalating the war by sending drones to targets in Russia, including Moscow?
Well, yes. I mean, this is something that Biden has been very concerned about, because he knows that this is part of the escalation that then will have retaliation from the part of the Russians, and will just increase this spiral of violence. That's why he doesn't want to send long-range missiles. That's why he has tried to pose these lines that he has continuously violated himself. But I think there is a tremendous desire, and we can understand that, on the part of the people of Ukraine to bring the war into Russia, to have the Russian people feel the same kind of fear and suffering that they are feeling. But this leads us much, much closer to a direct war with Russia.
I just want to jump back because I had a question relating to the last question you answered. We know that many European nations and the US have special forces on the ground, and we know that because of a leak. I thought it was a really telling moment for American diplomats, because Blinken immediately said, well, we're going to find the person who leaked this, but never addressed the reality that we had troops on the ground, special forces troops. What happens if those special forces troops are killed? Is it because it's classified, they don't it doesn't involve the treaties, or the reality that several European powers do have special forces on the ground? Does that put us at risk of a third world war, or more at risk of a third world war?
Well, absolutely. As much as the US would try to keep quiet the fact that anybody in a special force was killed, these kind of things leaked out. And yes, that would be a moment where there would be a number of Republicans who are saying, we have to fight back. We have to send forces in there. I think it's very dangerous. We know from those leaked documents that there are special forces, not only from the US, but even more from the UK. And then what about the US contractors who are in Ukraine to work with the Ukrainians on training? I met a number of Americans when I was in Ukraine who you could tell from the first 2 minutes of a conversation that they were working for the US Department of Defense in some kind of civilian contractor position. So there are lots of them there. And yes, I agree with you, Will, that this is a grave danger, that some of them would be killed, and that this would be a cause for US direct involvement.
So for Moji and Don, I am going to try to get to your second questions, but I just want to make sure we get everybody who's asked one, we get their questions out. So this one's from Amy, our board chair. And I'm just going to preface it by saying one of my first emails after Russia invaded, I talked about what the US and NATO role was in provoking the conflict. And I tried to do so in a sensitive manner that would could be heard across the spectrum of our membership. And that email in particular, it had 5 people write me angry emails and unsubscribe, and 3 of them did so because I was a Putin propagandist, and 2 of them did so because I was a State Department propagandist. Same email, and we lost five subscribers because 2 off of one side and 3 off of the other. So Amy's question is, thoughts on how we in the peace movement can work together on this issue despite our internal disagreements on it. And I think of folks in the Peace Action Network who take offense to use of the word coup when you're talking about the 2014 uprisings. I'm thinking about people who followed Russiagate very closely and believe that Trump was a product of Putin, and are appalled that we could be critical first of the U.S. role in this. How have you found you can work across those disagreements in the peace movement?
Well, I think that we have to find our areas of agreement. I think we could agree to disagree on the whether it was a uprising of dignity or whether it turned into a coup. We can agree to disagree on the level of importance you give to NATO expansion and US involvement. And then you can say, we both agree that we want the suffering to end. We both agree that we want to stop the killing, stop the possibility of a nuclear war, of a third world war. And so don't we both agree then that this war is not winnable on the ground? I would ask them, have you read the leaked documents? Have you read what's coming out now in CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, saying that this counteroffensive is a failure? And so if indeed there is not a solution on the ground, then I would ask, what is your solution? Where do you see this going? And oftentimes I kind of just get a blank of saying, well, we've got to stop Russia. And I would say, well, we are stopping Russia. Russia was not able to take over Ukraine. There will not be a pro-Putin person in the presidency of Ukraine. And Russia has been significantly weakened by this. But now is the time to come to our senses and go back to the position that both sides were willing to go to earlier on. See, can we get back to that point where it was Ukraine be a NATO, a neutral country, Russian troops out, Donbass referendum, put off the issue of Crimea? Can't we go back to that? And then I would also say, I think I didn't answer the question that was part of somebody's question about the Republicans and can we trust working with them? And I think that's an important point as well, because a lot of these Republicans don't want the money to be spent in Russia, but they want it to be spent to get ready to attack China or to be used at the border. And so we don't agree on many, many issues, but I think just on this one, we can work together. And this amendment that I mentioned that was put forward by Congressman Warren Davidson about what is your definition of victory, what's your peace plan, and what will this cost, is going to be an amendment now on the 24 billion if amendments are allowed. And if not, it will be a standalone bill. And that's something where I think we can work with Republicans, including a Republican senator in the House, Mike Lee, who has worked with Bernie Sanders in the past to try to stop the war in Yemen. And that's one where we could go to all of our Congress people, Democrat and Republican, and say, please sign on to that very common sense amendment.
All right, so I think we're down to our last question or two. Don's had his hand up for a while. It's a second question, but go ahead, Don.
Yes. So the title of your book is "Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict or Senseless War." But it, as I said in my comment in the chat, the war makes complete sense. It was planned by in my opinion, it was planned by the neocons because the Rand Corporation and the bunch of senior diplomats said, if you expand NATO into Ukraine, it will result in a war. And Putin was not eager for this war. He was desperate to come to a peace agreement. He tried in December of 2021. So what I'm getting to is, I think it's very important to insist that, yes, the US has blood on its hands. It shares guilt. Both sides can be, I don't justify Putin's invasion, but I would say that the invasion of Ukraine was more justified than Bush and Cheney's invasion of Iraq. So I wanted you to comment on this, maybe on the title of your book. Thanks.
Well, I'm saying it's a senseless war in terms of, war that is going to, we hope, if it doesn't turn into a bigger war, end up with a kind of compromise that should have been reached before the war began. And in terms of this being worse than the invasion of Iraq, it's hard to make comparisons, but in this case I will, because Ukraine is on Russia's border, whereas Iraq is thousands of miles away from the United States. There was
I said it was better. Excuse me. I said that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was more justified than the US invasion of Iraq. That's what I said.
Agreeing with you there and saying that the US invasion of Iraq was totally unjustified. It wasn't even on our border. There was zero threat coming from Iraq to attack the United States. And of course, Iraq was not involved in the 9/11 attack. So I agree with you there.
Doug Whitbeck came in from Facebook, found the link because he was watching on Facebook and wanted to ask a question. Doug, did you want to unmute and ask? Oh, okay. He says it's been answered. All right. So last question then will be Moji's second question. So Moji wants to know, what's the role in artificial intelligence? Do you, and I wouldn't be able to answer this question. Yeah, so I wonder if you can. What's the role of artificial intelligence in perpetuating this conflict, including Israeli and Iranian Revolutionary Guards and artificial intelligence outlets?
Well, I really have no idea. The only thing I can say to that is that this has been an exercise in testing all of the weapons, whether it's the use of AI or whether it's the use of more traditional weapons or new weapons. Unfortunately, this will only strengthen the ability of countries to attack each other in all kinds of ways. We see the Iranian drones that are being used to a great extent by the Russians. We see all over the world more weapons being produced, more money being spent on weapons, AI being used in this process as well. And I think it's really, except for the profits that we talked about from the companies that benefit from war, it's been a lose, lose, lose for the entire world community. And I only hope that out of this, we can push for a negotiated settlement, and we can show people in this country how insane it is that when we have the kind of fires that we just saw in Maui, when we have the floods and the hurricanes, and when we see the daily effects of climate change, to not work with Russia, to not work with China, to not be cooperating to deal with the existential threat of the planet is really unconscionable. And we have to move from this way of viewing and being in the world that is through the lens of militarism to one that focuses on cooperation.
Well, thank you so much, Medea. It's a great note to end on. Deeply appreciate you coming on tonight and giving us your perspective. If you want to continue this conversation, October 23rd, we'll have Dr. Joseph Gerson, who's been involved in the Track 2 diplomatic talks, and he's going to give us an update in October. Upcoming right down the pipe, next Monday will be my last presentation as director. Reflections on my 14 years here at New Hampshire Peace Action. 2 weeks after that, September 11th, we're going to talk about Boat Lift, which is the story of how Manhattan was evacuated after 9/11. There may be some upcoming news on a vigil or rally in Concord for ending wars and global warming. Stay tuned on our email list for that. September 25th, Mark Klim and the Phoenix Peace Builders will talk to us about the principles of Kingian nonviolence. So lots of good program coming down the pipe. And thank you again for everyone who joined, and to Medea for your presentation.
Thank you so much. A final plug for joining Peace in Ukraine, which people can join as individuals or as organizations. And we need you to work with us to build up these October global events. Thank you.